What if the love of your life was also the one person you couldn't have? Olivia Bennett was just an ambitious intern trying to prove herself. Ethan Caldwell was the untouchable CEO who ruled the corporate world with an iron will. A chance encounter on a subway changed everything. But fear, ambition, and pride tore them apart. When Olivia walked away, Ethan let her go. But love has a way of finding its way back. If you're brave enough to fight for it, will they risk everything for a second chance? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. The subway doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, and Olivia Bennett stepped inside, exhaustion clinging to her like a second skin. The city's night air had been crisp, but in here it was warm and crowded, packed with weary commuters trying to get home after another long day. She clutched her bag tighter, her eyes scanning for an empty seat as the train rumbled forward. Her head throbbed, and her feet ached from running errands and back to back meetings at the marketing firm where she interned. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting a dull glow over the sea of passengers. Olivia stifled a yawn and finally spotted it, a single empty seat near the middle of the car. Without hesitation, she navigated through the tangle of bodies, slipped into the seat, and exhaled in relief. It wasn't until she settled in that she noticed the man sitting beside her. He looked to be in his late 20s, dressed in a well-tailored navy suit, though his loosened tie and slightly tousled dark hair suggested a long day of his own. His sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes, which were fixed on the window, gave him an air of quiet authority. But there was something else, a weariness in his posture, the kind that Olivia recognized all too well. She barely paid him any attention. Her body was beyond tired, her thoughts sluggish from the relentless pace of the past few weeks. The steady hum of the train, the rhythmic sway of the car. It all made it impossible to fight the fatigue pressing down on her. Just a few minutes, she told herself. Just long enough to rest her eyes. The next lurch of the subway sent her tilting sideways, and before she could catch herself, her head landed softly against the stranger's shoulder. Olivia barely registered the warmth of his suit jacket, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Sleep wrapped around her quickly, pulling her under. Ethan Caldwell stiffened slightly at the unexpected weight against him. He turned his head just enough to glance down at the young woman now resting against him. He didn't know whether to be amused or annoyed. Her soft chestnut waves had fallen over her face, her lips parted slightly as she breathed. She looked completely unguarded, utterly exhausted. Across from them, his assistant, Cole, leaned in slightly, his voice low. Ethan considered it. Normally, he would have shifted away, unwilling to engage with a stranger, much less allow one to use him as a pillow. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she had collapsed against him so trustingly, as if she had no choice but to surrender to sleep. Maybe it was the sheer innocence of it, the stark contrast to the cutthroat world he lived in. A faint smirk tugged at his lips. "No," he murmured. "Let her sleep." Cole hesitated, glancing at Olivia, then back at Ethan. "Are you sure?" Ethan shot him a look that needed no explanation. Cole sighed, leaning back in his seat, but the corner of his mouth twitched in amusement. The subway continued its journey through the city, the occasional jerk of the car causing Olivia to shift slightly, her body unconsciously molding into the space beside Ethan. At one point, she sighed softly, nuzzling a little closer. Ethan exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. This was ridiculous. He had billion-dollar deals waiting for him. Clients who expected perfection, competitors who would kill for a moment of weakness. And yet, here he was, letting some random intern. He had noticed the company badge clipped to her bag, sleep on his shoulder like they were anything but strangers. He didn't know how long they sat like that, but when the train jolted to a stop at the next station, Olivia stirred. Olivia stirred. A slow inhale, a furrow of her brow, and then her eyes fluttered open. She blinked in hazy confusion before her gaze landed on the shoulder she'd been resting against. Realization struck.
Oh my God!
She gasped, jerking upright so fast she nearly smacked her forehead against his jaw. Ethan raised an amused brow. I'm so sorry, she stammered, her cheeks flaming with embarrassment. He tilted his head slightly, regarding her with a calm curiosity. Are you always this dramatic when you wake up? Olivia's mortification deepened. Before she could respond, she caught a glimpse of the station sign through the window. Her stomach dropped. My stop, she breathed. I missed my stop. Panic surged through her as she scrambled for her bag. In her rush, her elbow knocked into the cup, sitting in the holder beside Ethan. The lid popped off, and in horrifying slow motion, dark liquid splashed across his crisp white shirt. Olivia froze, eyes wide in horror. Oh no. Cole, seated across from them, stiffened. Sir? Ethan looked down at the spreading stain, his expression unreadable. Olivia, frantic, yanked a handful of napkins from her bag and instinctively reached forward, dabbing at the mess. I'm so sorry. I'll pay for the dry cleaning or... A deep, unexpected laugh rumbled from Ethan's chest. Olivia blinked up at him, utterly baffled. Don't worry about it, he said smoothly, amusement flickering in his sharp blue eyes. I think I owe you anyway, for that rather comfortable nap you took. Olivia groaned, covering her face with her hands. She had never wanted to disappear more in her life. The next morning, Olivia stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the blazer over her blouse. Today was important. Intern presentation day. After weeks of grueling work, she and the other interns would finally get a chance to pitch their marketing strategies to the company's senior executives. It was her shot at proving herself, at showing them she was more than just another intern fetching coffee and taking notes. She had spent countless late nights refining her presentation, triple-checking her data, and memorizing every key talking point. If she nailed this, she had a real chance at securing a permanent position. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her laptop and hurried out the door. By the time she arrived at the glass-walled conference room, a thick tension already filled the air. The other interns were seated, whispering amongst themselves, their nervous energy contagious. The long mahogany table at the front of the room was occupied by a panel of senior executives, all exuding an intimidating level of authority and experience. Olivia's stomach tightened. She barely had time to take her seat before the main doors swung open again. The room fell silent. A man strode inside, his presence commanding instant attention. Olivia turned to glance at the newcomer and nearly choked on air. It was him. The man from the subway. The man whose shoulder she had drooled on. The man whose shirt she had ruined. Except now, in the stark lighting of the conference room, he was no weary commuter in a slightly loosened tie. He was polished, confident, and radiating power in a way that made her pulse spike with something dangerously close to panic. Ethan Caldwell, CEO of the entire company. Olivia's blood ran cold. She had spilled coffee on the CEO of Caldwell Industries. He moved toward the head of the table, effortlessly composed. If he recognized her, he gave no indication. Meanwhile, Olivia felt like her soul had left her body. This is not happening. She stole another glance at him, but he was already seated, fingers tipping idly against the surface of the table, his expression unreadable. Did he seriously not remember her? Or was he just pretending? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. The meeting began, and one by one, the interns stood up to present their projects. Some fumbled nervously, their voices shaky. Others delivered polished, confident pitches, clearly prepared for this moment. Olivia forced herself to focus, pushing aside the growing anxiety pooling in her chest. And then it was her turn. She stood up, smoothing her blouse, and walked to the front of the room. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite the chaos in her head. "My name is Olivia Bennett, and today I'll be presenting a new digital marketing strategy designed to increase our engagement with Gen Z consumers." As she spoke, she gradually found her rhythm. The room faded away, leaving only her and her work. She clicked through her slides, explaining how social media trends had shifted, outlining data-driven engagement strategies, and proposing an innovative campaign to modernize the company's brand appeal. By the time she reached her final slide, a quiet confidence had settled over her. "Thank you," she concluded, stepping back from the podium. Silence. Then, polite applause. She exhaled slowly, relief flooding her system, until Ethan leaned forward, finally breaking his silence. "Impressive presentation," he remarked casually, his voice smooth as ever. "But I do have a question." Olivia stiffened. Of course he had a question. Ethan tilted his head slightly, his blue eyes glinting with something unreadable. "You mentioned that our current digital outreach isn't resonating with Gen Z consumers. However, according to recent analytics, engagement on our TikTok platform has actually increased by 27 in the last quarter. Given that, what specific data set did you use to support your claim?" Silence. Several interns exchanged uneasy glances. Olivia could feel all eyes on her. This was a test. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "That's a great point," she replied, straightening her posture. "The 27th increase you're referring to is primarily driven by short-form content featuring influencer collaborations. However, our long-term brand engagement, meaning the content that translates into actual consumer loyalty, has seen a decline of 15. My research focuses on that aspect, which is why my proposed strategy emphasizes retention rather than just short-term viral reach." A beat of silence. Then, Ethan's lips curved into something almost resembling a smirk. "Well argued," he said, nodding slightly. Olivia barely had time to process what had just happened before another executive chimed in with a different question, shifting the focus elsewhere. But as she returned to her seat, she could still feel Ethan's eyes on her. And for the first time since she had entered the room, she knew without a doubt. He remembered her. The meeting had barely adjourned when Olivia gathered her things, still reeling from the intense hour she'd just endured. The moment Ethan had challenged her in front of the entire room. Her pulse had spiked so hard she thought she might actually faint, but she had answered him. More than that, she had held her ground. And he had acknowledged it. She stole a glance at him as she slipped her laptop into her bag. He was speaking with one of the executives, his expression cool and composed as ever. If there had been any recognition in his gaze earlier, it was gone now. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe he really didn't remember her from the subway at all. As she turned toward the door, a shadow loomed beside her. Ms. Bennett. She looked up to find a man in a crisp black suit standing there, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Caldwell would like to see you in his office." Her stomach flipped. "Me?" she blurted out before she could stop herself. The man, his assistant, probably, simply nodded. A few of the interns nearby exchanged curious glances, their silent questions burning into her back. Olivia forced herself to square her shoulders, ignoring the nervous twist in her gut. She had no choice but to follow. The walk to Ethan's office felt like the longest of her life. The sleek hallways, the polished glass walls, the hushed conversations of high-powered executives. It was all a blur when they finally arrived, The assistant gestured for her to step inside. Ethan stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the city skyline beyond. The late afternoon sunlight cast a sharp glow against his suit, illuminating the strong angles of his face. He didn't turn around immediately. For a moment, Olivia debated whether she should speak first. But before she could open her mouth, he finally broke the silence. "You always answer questions that well under pressure." His voice was smooth, controlled, but there was something else beneath it, something laced with amusement. Olivia hesitated before responding. "Only when the person asking is trying to catch me off guard." That made him chuckle, a quiet, rich sound. Finally, he turned to face her, arms now crossed over his chest. Up close, he looked even more intimidating than he had in the conference room. But there was something different about him now, something more relaxed. "I called you here because I have a proposition," he said smoothly. Her heart stuttered. Proposition?" He nodded. "There's a project I'm overseeing personally. One that requires fresh marketing insight. Your presentation showed me that you think differently, and I want that on my team." Olivia's stomach flipped again, but for an entirely different reason. "You want me on your team?" she echoed, still trying to process his words. Ethan leaned slightly against the desk, his gaze steady. "I want you as my temporary assistant. Strictly for this project. You'll work directly with me, help develop a strategy, and present it at the final stage." Her mind raced. This was huge. Most interns barely got FaceTime with executives, let alone the CEO himself. And yet something about this felt too good to be true. "Why me?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Ethan's expression didn't change. "Because you're smart. Because you defended your data under pressure. And because I need someone who isn't afraid to challenge me." His words sent a shiver down her spine. This opportunity could change her career. Working alongside Ethan Caldwell would open doors she hadn't even dreamed of. But it could also bring problems. She thought of the way he had looked at her in the conference room. The subtle amusement when she had panicked in the subway. The fact that even now, she still wasn't sure if he truly didn't remember her, or if he was just pretending. She hesitated. "Mr. Caldwell, Ethan." She blinked. "What?" "If we're going to be working together," he said, tilting his head slightly, "you might as well drop the formalities." Olivia was thrown off by his casual tone. Was he always like this, or was this just for her? She swallowed hard. "This is unexpected." His lips twitched. "Is that, yes?" She thought about it. About the rumors that would spread, the scrutiny, the pressure. Then she thought about the kind of opportunity this was, and the kind of man standing in front of her. Finally, she took a breath, lifted her chin, and nodded. "Yes, yes." Ethan studied her for a moment, then pushed off the desk, extending a hand. "Welcome to the team, Olivia." She shook it. And the second their hands touched, she had a distinct, unsettling feeling that her life was about to change forever. The first few days of working directly under Ethan Caldwell were nothing short of a whirlwind. Olivia had expected it to be intense. After all, the man was a legend in the business world, but nothing could have prepared her for just how relentless he was. Ethan didn't just demand excellence. He expected it. Her mornings now started earlier and ended far later. Every meeting, every brainstorming session, every strategy discussion was like stepping onto a battlefield. Ethan moved fast, cutting through ideas with sharp precision, dissecting weaknesses before anyone else even saw them. He was intimidating, but not in the way Olivia had imagined. He wasn't the type to yell or micromanage. He simply expected everyone to keep up. Most didn't, but Olivia had no intention of being one of them. By the end of her first week, she had learned to anticipate his questions before he asked them, to have her data ready before he even requested it. She matched his pace, challenged his ideas when necessary, and proved, time and time again, that she belonged in the room. Ethan never praised her outright, but there were moments. A slight nod when she caught an error in a proposal before he did. A brief flicker of approval when she held her own in a strategy debate. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push her forward. Still, working with him came with its own set of complications. Because the longer she spent by his side, the more Olivia realized just how dangerous this arrangement was. Not professionally, she could handle the pressure. But personally, that was another story entirely. It was the way he carried himself, calm, controlled, always one step ahead, the way his sharp blue eyes flickered with something unreadable when she surprised him, the way his voice dropped lower when they were alone in late-night meetings, the office dimly lit, the world outside quiet. He was never inappropriate. Never crossed a line. But there was something there, something unspoken. And Olivia felt it. One evening, long after most of the office had emptied out, she found herself in the conference room with him, going over the final details of a major client proposal. The floor-to-ceiling windows cast a reflection of the city skyline against the polished wood table, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound between them. Ethan leaned back in his chair, reviewing a report she'd compiled. He was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "This is good." Olivia blinked. Ethan Caldwell wasn't known for handing out compliments. "Good," she repeated, arching a brow. That almost sounded like praise. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Don't get used to it." She rolled her eyes, but couldn't stop the small smile that formed. Ethan set the report down, his gaze shifting to her. "What made you get into marketing?" The question caught her off guard. Their conversations were usually about projections, data, and strategy, not personal history. "Still," she answered. "I wanted to understand people," she admitted, fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. "Why they buy what they buy. What they buy what they buy. What makes them connect to a brand, a story." She hesitated before adding, "What about you?" His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. Control. Olivia frowned. Control. Ethan exhaled, his fingers tapping idly against the table. When you build something from nothing, you learn quickly that control is everything. The moment you lose it, he paused, then shook his head. Everything falls apart. She studied him. The quiet tension in his jaw, the flicker of something almost vulnerable in his gaze. It was the first real glimpse she had into the man behind the CEO. Before she could say anything, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression returning to its usual unreadable mask. "That's enough for tonight," he said, standing. "We'll finalize the details tomorrow." Olivia nodded, gathering her things. But just as she reached for her bag, her hand knocked against his, sending a stack of papers scattering across the table. They both froze. Their fingers had brushed, just for a second, but the electricity that shot through her made her breath hitch. Ethan didn't move, neither did she. Then, as quickly as it had happened, he pulled away, clearing his throat. "Be more careful next time," he said, his voice clipped. Olivia swallowed hard, forcing a neutral expression. "Right. Next time." She turned and walked out of the conference room, her pulse hammering. She needed to get a grip. Because whatever this was, this tension, this pull between them, it couldn't happen. It wouldn't. She wouldn't let it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of high-stakes meetings, late-night brainstorming sessions, and relentless deadlines. Olivia had expected the pressure. What she hadn't expected was how much she thrived under it. She learned to anticipate Ethan's questions before he asked them, to refine her strategies to the point where even he struggled to poke holes in them. It was exhilarating, in a way. He pushed her, challenged her, and every time she met his expectations, she felt a quiet surge of pride. But it wasn't just the work. It was him. The way he listened when she spoke, even in a room full of seasoned executives. The way his gaze lingered a fraction too long when he thought she wasn't looking. The way his voice softened, just barely. When they were alone in his office, the city lights casting long shadows across the polished floor. He was careful, always maintaining that invisible barrier between them. But there were moments that made Olivia wonder if she was the only one feeling this impossible pull between them. Like the time she had brought him coffee before a morning meeting. He had taken a sip, then arched a brow. Hazelnut? She shrugged.
You seem like a hazelnut person.
Ethan had studied her for a moment, something flickering in his expression before he murmured, noted. Or the time they had been reviewing a client pitch in his office late one evening, exhaustion settling into her bones. She had leaned back in her chair, rubbing at her temples, and without a word, Ethan had slid a glass of water toward her. Drink, he had said simply. It was nothing. And yet, it wasn't. But for every moment of quiet understanding, there was an equal and opposite force pulling them back into reality. Like the whispers. Olivia wasn't naive. She knew how it looked. Some of her colleagues were subtle about it, their eyes flicking between her and Ethan when they thought she wouldn't notice. Others were less so. I heard he offered her a position personally, someone murmured as she walked past the break room one afternoon. I mean, let's be honest, another voice snickered.
Shh.
Olivia's fingers clenched around the file she was holding. She had worked her ass off to be here. She had stayed up nights perfecting her strategies, double-checked her data, made damn sure she earned her place at that table. But to them, none of that mattered. Not her intelligence, not her ambition, not the countless hours she had poured into proving herself. Just the fact that she was a woman in a room full of men. Her jaw tightened. Fine. Because when she proved them wrong, it would be all the more satisfying. But even as she brushed off the rumors, the weight of them settled in the back of her mind. And that weight only grew heavier when she found herself alone with Ethan in his office, later that evening, reviewing the final plans for their latest campaign. She was in the middle of running through the last set of projections when she felt it, his gaze on her. Not in the sharp, assessing way he usually watched her work. Something else. Something warmer. Olivia hesitated, fingers hovering over her laptop keyboard. Something wrong? She asked carefully. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. You hear what they're saying, don't you? Her stomach twisted. Of course, he knew. He was Ethan Caldwell. He noticed everything. She forced a shrug.
Does it matter?
He studied her, his expression unreadable. It should. Something in his voice made her heart stutter. She straightened, meeting his gaze head on. I earned this, Ethan. I worked for it, and I'm not going to let a few rumors make me question that. A muscle ticked in his jaw. Then, so quietly, she almost didn't hear it. I know. Her breath caught. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt heavier than it should have, charged with something neither of them dared to name. And then, just like always, Ethan was the first to break the moment. "Let's finish this," he said, his voice steady once more. And just like always, Olivia nodded, ignoring the ache in her chest. Because whatever this was, whatever had been simmering between them for weeks, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. And she wasn't about to be the fool who forgot that. The change was subtle at first. A flicker in his gaze, a slight shift in his tone. A moment too long spent watching her from across the office when he thought she wouldn't notice. Olivia wasn't sure when it started, but she felt it. The tension between them, tightening like a wire, ready to snap. And then came Lucas. Lucas Harper was a junior executive in the marketing department. Charismatic, sharp, and, most importantly, easy to be around. Unlike Ethan, who kept himself wrapped in layers of control, Lucas was open, effortlessly charming in a way that made people gravitate toward him. He was also the first real friend Olivia had made at the company. They often worked on the same campaigns. And more than once, he had made her laugh during grueling late-night editing sessions. There was nothing between them, at least not in the way people assumed, but that didn't stop the whispers from shifting focus. And it definitely didn't stop Ethan from noticing. The first time Olivia caught the change in him, it was during a Monday morning meeting. She and Lucas had walked in together, still chuckling over some joke he had made about a particularly difficult client. She hadn't thought anything of it until she took her seat and felt it. Ethan's stare. Cold, calculated, assessing. He didn't say anything, didn't so much as acknowledge her beyond the usual professional nod, but Olivia knew that look. He wasn't pleased. At first, she ignored it. He had no reason to care who she spent time with outside of work, and she certainly wasn't about to ask him if he did. But as the days passed, his demeanor toward her shifted. It was in the way he spoke to her, shorter, more clipped. In the way he critiqued her work, sharper, less patient. In the way his jaw tensed every time she laughed at something Lucas said. The final confirmation came one evening when Olivia was heading out of the office. She and Lucas had wrapped up a strategy session, and he had been walking her to the elevator when Ethan's voice cut through the hallway. "Bennett." Olivia turned, pulse skipping a beat. Ethan stood just outside his office, one hand in his pocket, the other gripping the edge of the doorframe. His expression was unreadable, but his blue eyes were sharp, locked onto her with an intensity that made it impossible to move. Lucas glanced between them, smirking slightly. "I'll see you tomorrow, Olivia." Ethan's gaze flicked to him, something dark flashing behind his eyes. Only after Lucas disappeared down the hall did Ethan speak again. "My office." It wasn't a request. Olivia squared her shoulders, ignoring the ridiculous flutter of nerves in her stomach, and stepped inside. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, she crossed her arms. "Mr. Caldwell?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Drop the formalities, Olivia." She lifted a brow. "You seem to prefer them these days." Something flickered in his gaze, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he leaned against his desk, his expression unreadable. "Is he your boyfriend?" The question sent a shock through her system. She blinked. "What?" "Lucas." His voice was measured, but there was an edge to it. "Are you dating him?" A rush of frustration flooded her. Why does it matter? Ethan's jaw tightened. It doesn't. She let out a breathless laugh. "Right. That's why you've been acting like I personally offended you every time I talk to him." Silence. He didn't deny it. Didn't offer An excuse. Just watched her, his expression unreadable. She should have left it at that. Should have walked out before she said something she couldn't take back. But she was tired. Tired of pretending she didn't notice the way he looked at her. Tired of acting like the tension between them wasn't real. So she stepped closer. "Do you want the truth?" she asked, her voice softer now. Ethan's Adam's apple bobbed slightly as he swallowed, but he didn't move. She took another step. "He's my friend. That's it." A beat of silence. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, "Good." Her breath caught. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them crackled with something unsaid, something dangerous. Then Ethan straightened, clearing his throat. This conversation never happened. And just like that, the wall was back up. Olivia exhaled, forcing herself to nod. Of course. She turned, reaching for the door handle, but before she could step out, his voice stopped her one last time. "Olivia." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. His eyes met hers, something unreadable flickering beneath the surface. "Be careful with him." She frowned. "Lucas?" A pause. Then, softer. "With anyone." Her heart clenched. And for the first time, she wondered if she was really the only one struggling to keep her distance. The storm rolled in late that evening, thick gray clouds stretching over the city skyline, lightning splitting the sky as sharp, jagged lines. By the time Olivia realized how late it was, the office was nearly empty. Only the low hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic tapping of her fingers against the keyboard filled the silence. She had stayed behind to finalize the last details of their latest campaign, determined to make sure everything was perfect before the final client review. The last thing she needed was to give Ethan another reason to scrutinize her work. He had been colder lately, more distant, and she knew exactly why. Lucas. The tension between them had been building for weeks, tightening with every glance, every unspoken word. And yet, here they were, still pretending, still walking the careful line between professionalism and something they refused to name. Olivia sighed, leaning back in her chair. The rain had started now, heavy and unrelenting, pelting against the glass windows in steady sheets. She checked the time. Nearly 10. She needed to go home. She stood, gathering her things, when she heard it. A voice from down the hall. Low, familiar. "Ethan?" Curiosity tugged at her, and before she could stop herself, she was walking toward the sound. His office door was slightly ajar, warm light spilling into the darkened hallway. She hesitated, hand hovering just shy of knocking, until she heard the frustration in his voice. "I don't care about the projections," he snapped, his tone unusually sharp. "The deal isn't happening." A pause. Then, quieter, tired. "No, it's not about the numbers. It's about trust." Silence. Olivia swallowed hard, something twisting in her chest. She had never heard him sound like that before, like he wasn't just the unshakable CO, but a man carrying the weight of something heavier than business negotiations. She didn't mean to step inside, but she did. Ethan looked up sharply, his eyes flashing with something unreadable. His phone was still in his hand, the conversation clearly unfinished. "I'll call you back." A click. Then silence. Olivia shifted on her feet. "I didn't mean to interrupt." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You didn't. Liar." She hesitated, glancing toward his desk. There was a photo resting near his laptop, the edges worn, like it had been handled too many times. Before she could make out the details, Ethan followed her gaze and flipped it over, hiding it from view. Something about that made her chest ache. She shouldn't have asked. But she did. "Are you okay?" Ethan went still, his fingers tightening around the edge of his desk. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, finally, I don't know. The honesty in those 3 words startled her more than anything else he could have said. Ethan Caldwell didn't do vulnerability. He didn't let people in. And yet, right now, standing in front of her, he looked exhausted. Not just from work, but from whatever weight he carried behind closed doors. She didn't know what possessed her to step closer, but she did. "You don't have to tell me," she murmured. "But..." His eyes met hers, something flickering behind them, something dangerous. For a second, she thought he might actually say something. But then, like always, he pulled back. "You should go home," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Disappointment settled low in her stomach. "Yeah," she said softly. "I should." She turned, reaching for the door, and then the power cut out. Darkness swallowed the room in an instant, the storm outside flashing bright for only a second before plunging them into blackness again. Olivia sucked in a sharp breath. "Great," she muttered. "Just perfect." A beat of silence. Then a low chuckle. "You okay?" Ethan's voice closer now, somewhere to her left. She rolled her eyes.
Oh, sure.
Being trapped in a dark office in the middle of a storm is exactly how I planned to spend my evening. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, and she caught a glimpse of him watching her, his arms crossed, amusement flickering in his gaze. "You're not afraid of the dark, are you?" She scoffed. "Of course not." Another rumble of thunder. A particularly loud one. Olivia tensed before she could stop herself, and Ethan's smirk widened. "Right," he said dryly. She huffed. "Okay, fine. Maybe just a little." A pause. Then, "Come here. Come here." Her stomach flipped.
What?
She heard him shift in the darkness. "You can sit on the couch until the power comes back. Better than standing there looking like you're about to run for your life." She wanted to argue, to say she was fine, that she didn't need him to look out for her. But then, lightning struck again, and she caught the way he was watching her, not mocking, not teasing. Just waiting. She sighed. Fine. Carefully, she made her way toward the couch, using the brief flashes of light from the storm to navigate. When she sat down, the space beside her was empty. And then it wasn't. Ethan took the seat next to her, his presence solid, steady. They didn't speak. Not for a long time. And somehow, in the quiet, Olivia realized something. Maybe the storm wasn't outside. Maybe it had been brewing between them all along. The tension between them didn't disappear after that night. If anything, it grew stronger. Something had shifted in the darkness of his office, in the quiet moments when neither of them had spoken. As sitting side by side as the storm raged outside, Olivia had felt it. The weight of something unspoken, something inevitable. But then the power had come back, and just like that, reality had returned with it. The next morning, Ethan was back to being untouchable, all sharp edges and unreadable expressions. And Olivia forced herself to pretend like nothing had happened. It was easier that way. Or at least, it should have been. Because ignoring him became a hell of a lot harder when she barely saw him anymore. At first, she thought she was imagining it. That he was just busier than usual. Meetings, client, negotiations, last-minute deals. Things that had nothing to do with her. But then, the pattern became obvious. She would walk into the conference room for a scheduled meeting, only to find that Ethan had sent his assistant instead. She would pass his office, glancing in out of habit, only to see him standing by the window, speaking on the phone, his gaze never once flicking toward her. And when they were in the same room, his eyes never lingered. His tone never softened. It was as if he had made a choice, a conscious decision to create distance between them. And Olivia hated how much that hurt. So, she made a choice too. She stopped waiting for his attention, stopped looking for him when she walked into a room. She threw herself into her work, spending more time on projects outside of his department, working with other executives, people who actually acknowledged her presence. People like Lucas. She hadn't intended to get closer to him. But with Ethan acting like she didn't exist, Lucas became easy. He was charming, he made her laugh, and most importantly, he was there. One evening, after wrapping up a long day, Lucas invited her out for drinks with a group from their department. "You could use a night out," he teased, nudging her lightly as they walked toward the elevator. Olivia smirked. "Are you saying I look like I'm drowning in work?" "I'm saying," he said, with a grin, "that if you keep up this pace, you're gonna burn yourself out. One drink, come on." She hesitated. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him. Ethan. Standing just a few feet away, speaking to an executive. His posture was as composed as ever, but for the briefest second, Olivia swore she saw something flicker across his face. She didn't let herself think about it. Instead, she turned to Lucas and smiled. "You know what? You're right. One drink." Lucas grinned. "That's the spirit." And just before she stepped onto the elevator, she glanced back. Just once. Ethan was already looking away, as if she wasn't even there. The whispers started the next morning. "I heard she was out with Lucas last night. They looked pretty cozy. I mean, can you blame her? He's gorgeous. And let's be honest, dating a junior exec is probably less complicated than a CO. Olivia clenched her jaw, but didn't react. She had spent too much time in this company proving herself to let office gossip get under her skin. But when she walked into the conference room for their weekly strategy meeting, she realized that ignoring it wouldn't be that simple. Ethan was already seated at the head of the table, scanning through reports. He didn't look up when she walked in, but his grip on the pen he was holding was just a little too tight. And when Lucas slid into the seat beside her with a casual grin, Ethan's fingers twitched. The meeting started. It was business as usual, except for the fact that Ethan barely addressed her. Anytime she spoke, he acknowledged her comments with a clipped nod or a brief "noted." No debate, no discussion. It was infuriating. By the time the meeting ended, Olivia was seconds away from snapping. But before she could even push back her chair, Ethan spoke. Bennett. She froze. Slowly, she turned toward him. For the first time in days, he was looking directly at her. "Stay behind," he said. "We need to talk." Her pulse jumped. Lucas glanced between them but said nothing, giving her a knowing look before slipping out the door with the rest of the team. Soon, it was just the two of them. Alone. Ethan stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he walked toward the windows, staring out at the city. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, "You're getting too close to him." Olivia blinked. "Excuse me." His jaw clenched. "Ooh." She huffed out a humorless laugh. "Is that a problem?" His grip tightened at his sides. "You tell me." Oh, this was about more than work. A slow, dangerous realization crept over her. She stepped closer. "Do you care?" she asked softly. Ethan went still. The silence stretched. And then, so quietly, she almost didn't hear it, "I shouldn't." Her heart pounded. Neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick, charged with something neither of them were ready to name. Finally, Olivia exhaled, stepping back. "You made your choice, Ethan," she whispered. "And so did I." She turned and walked out before he could stop her. And for the first time, she didn't look back. The decision had been easy to make, or at least that was what Olivia told herself. It wasn't just about Ethan, not entirely. She'd been working harder than ever, putting in long hours, proving herself to people who still whispered about how she got here. And now, finally, she had something to show for it. A job offer. Not just any job. One from a major firm, one of the best in the industry. A full-time position, higher pay, better benefits, and the chance to relocate. A fresh start. No more whispers. No more tension-filled meetings. No more stolen glances from a man who had already decided she wasn't worth the risk. This was what she had been working toward, right? So why did it feel like she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life? The thought lingered as she sat in front of her, the paperwork in front of her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the pen, her mind flashing back to the past few months. The late nights in the office, the heated arguments and strategy meetings, the way Ethan had looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. It doesn't matter. It never mattered. With one final breath, she signed her name. And just like that, it was done. She didn't expect to see him that night. The office was quiet, most employees already gone. Olivia had planned to finish out the rest of the week before officially leaving, but after submitting her resignation, she wasn't sure if she could bear it. She had just stepped into the elevator when a voice cut through the silence. Bennett, Bennett. Her heart lurched. Slowly, she turned. Ethan stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable, but something about the way his hands were clenched at his sides told her everything. She swallowed hard. "What are you doing here?" His jaw tightened. "I could ask you the same thing." Olivia let out a dry laugh, crossing her arms. "It's my last week. I figured I'd wrap things up." Ethan's eyes darkened. "So it's true." She hesitated. "You knew." A muscle in his jaw ticked. "Doesn't keep secrets from me, Olivia." Hearing him say her name felt like a punch to the chest. She forced herself to stand taller. "Then you already know. I'm leaving." Silence. Ethan stepped closer, and suddenly, it was too much. Too much tension. Too much history. Too much everything. "Say something," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair.
Oh, what do you want me to say?
"I don't know," she admitted, hating the way her voice shook. "Maybe that you care." His gaze locked onto hers. "You think it doesn't?" The words sent a shiver down her spine. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. Olivia swallowed hard, and his expression was pained, like he was at war with himself. "And I was wrong." The words hit her like a freight train. Ethan stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "Don't go," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Her breath caught. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. But it was too late. Her chest ached as she shook her head. "You don't get to say that now." Ethan flinched, but he didn't look away. "I needed you to fight for me weeks ago, Ethan," she continued, her voice cracking. "I needed you to want me before I had to walk away." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. She turned toward the elevator, pressing the button with more force than necessary. The doors slid open. Just before she stepped inside, he spoke again. "Olivia." She hesitated, her grip tightening on the strap of her bag. His voice was softer this time. "Is this really what you want?" She swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. "It doesn't matter what I want," she whispered. And then, without looking back, she stepped inside. The doors slid shut. And this time, he let her go. The weeks after Olivia left felt like they lasted a lifetime. At first, she told herself it was just an adjustment period. A new city, a new office, a new routine. She just needed time to settle in. Her new job was everything she had worked for. The position came with more responsibility, better pay, and the kind of projects she had always dreamed of leading. Her colleagues were sharp, talented, and welcoming. Everything was perfect. Except it wasn't. Because no matter how hard she tried, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Every morning, she woke up to the same hollow ache in her chest. Every night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last time she had seen Ethan. The look in his eyes when he had asked her to stay. The way his voice had cracked when he told her he'd been wrong. But she had left anyway. And now, she was paying the price for it. She tried to move on. She went out with colleagues after work, filling her evenings with laughter and conversation. She dated, a few times at least, but every man she met only reminded her of the one she had walked away from. The one she'd convinced herself didn't want her. The one who had let her go. Until the day she found the envelope on her desk. At first, she thought it was a client document. But when she turned it over, her breath caught in her throat. Her name was written on the front. In familiar, precise handwriting. Her hands trembled as she tore it open, heart hammering against her ribs. Inside was a single train ticket. And a note. "I'm still waiting for you on that train. Don't fall asleep this time." Olivia's breath hitched. She read the note again, and again. Ethan. Ethan. She shot up from her desk, her mind spinning. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. He wouldn't. Her phone buzzed. A message. "Train leaves at 6. Your choice, Bennett." Her fingers clenched around the ticket. It wasn't fair. She had spent weeks convincing herself that leaving had been the right decision. That Ethan was just a part of her past, nothing more. And now, with one note, he had shattered all of it. Because deep down, she already knew the truth. She had never really left him. Her body moved before she could second. Guess herself. Grabbing her coat, she rushed out of the office, ignoring the confused stares of her coworkers. By the time she reached the train station, her lungs were burning. The platform was crowded, people moving in every direction, but she only saw one thing. Him. Him. Ethan stood near the train, hands in his pockets, watching her with that infuriatingly calm expression. Like he had known she would come. Like he had never doubted it. She skidded to a stop a few feet away, breathless. "You're serious." His lips twitched, seemed fitting.
She let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "You idiot."
Ethan arched a brow. "That's how you greet me after leaving me in an empty office." Her heart clenched. "You let me go." His expression softened. "Because I thought it was what you needed." A lump formed in her throat. And now? He stepped closer, the world fading around them. Now I know that what I need is you." Her breath hitched. He wasn't asking this time. He wasn't hesitating. Ethan Caldwell. The man who had built an empire, the man who had spent his whole life making calculated decisions, was standing in front of her, choosing her. Finally, a shaky exhale escaped her lips.
What about the company, the rules, everything we told ourselves?
"I don't care." His voice was firm, unwavering. "Not about the company, not about what people think, not about any of it." His gaze burned into hers. "I just care about you." Her throat tightened. For so long, she had told herself they could never work, that they were too different, that love wasn't enough. But standing here, looking at him, she finally realized love had always been enough. Without another word, she closed the distance between them, throwing her arms around him. Ethan exhaled sharply, his arms wrapping around her like he was never going to let go again. And this time, he wouldn't have to. The train ride back felt surreal. Olivia sat beside Ethan, the rhythmic hum of the train filling the silence between them. The city lights blurred past the window, casting soft reflections across his sharp features. It had been months since they had been this close, months of distance, of pretending, of convincing themselves that walking away had been the right choice. Now all of that was gone. Ethan sat relaxed beside her, one arm draped casually along the back of their seat, fingers just shy of grazing her shoulder. He didn't speak, didn't push. He simply waited, letting her process the reality of what she had just done. Finally, Olivia exhaled, shifting slightly to face him. "So."
Wow!
Ethan turned his head, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "You tell me." She let out a breathless laugh. "You're the one who sent the train ticket." A smirk tugged at his lips. "And you're the one who showed up." She rolled her eyes, but she couldn't fight the smile forming on her lips. The ease between them, the way they fell into this natural rhythm. It had always been like this, even when things were complicated. Especially when things were complicated. Her gaze dropped to her hands, twisting in her lap. "I walked away for a reason, Ethan." "I know." His voice was softer now. She swallowed. "I didn't want to get in the way of your career. I didn't want to be a scandal. A distraction." Ethan let out a quiet laugh, low and slightly bitter. "You think I care about that?" She looked up at him.
You should.
He leaned in slightly, his voice steady. "You were never a distraction, Olivia." She blinked. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand along his jaw. "Do you know how miserable it's been without you?" Her breath hitched. "I thought I was making the right choice by letting you go," he continued. "By staying focused, by putting the company first." His fingers curled against the seat, knuckles tightening. "But all I did was spend every damn day regretting it." Her heart pounded. He turned toward her fully now, no longer holding back. "I don't care about the rules, about the expectations. I don't care what people think. I care about you." She could barely breathe. "So if you're still worried about whether we can do this, let me make it easy for you." He reached for her hand, his touch warm, grounding. "We already are." A lump formed in her throat. She wanted to believe him. She did. But she had spent so long telling herself that they, were impossible, that no matter how much she loved him, their worlds would never align. Ethan must have seen the hesitation in her eyes, because his grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I've spent my whole life making calculated decisions," he said, voice lower now, rougher. and I built everything I have by making the right ones." He exhaled, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "But letting you go was the worst mistake I've ever made." Her chest ached. For so long, she had been waiting for him to say the words, to fight for her the way she had wanted him to. Now, here he was. Olivia inhaled sharply. Shaking her head, she let out a watery laugh. "You're really bad at this whole grand gesture thing." Ethan smirked. "Yeah?" She nodded, eyes shining.
A train ticket?
"That's the best you could come up with." He chuckled, the deep sound settling in her bones. "It worked, didn't it?" She bit her lip, looking at him through her lashes. "Yeah, it did." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if pulled by some invisible force, Olivia leaned in. Ethan met her halfway. The kiss was slow, unhurried, as if they were making up for all the time they had wasted apart. His hand slid to the back of her neck, fingers tangling in her hair, holding her close. She sighed against his lips, her hands curling into his shirt, pulling him closer, as if she was afraid he would slip away again. But this time, he wouldn't. Ethan pulled back just enough to whisper against her lips, "Stay." Her eyes fluttered open, searching his. This wasn't like before. This wasn't him asking her to give up her dreams, to sacrifice her career for him. This was him choosing her. No rules, no distance, no hesitation. A slow smile curved her lips. "I thought you'd never ask." The first day back at Caldwell Industries felt surreal. Olivia hadn't expected to return. Not like this. Not as someone who walked in through those glass doors belonging, rather than merely surviving. But this time, things were different. She wasn't an intern scrambling to prove herself, wasn't just a young professional trying to navigate the ruthless world of corporate power. She was here. And so was he. Ethan stood at the far end of the lobby, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same steady gaze that had made her knees weak on the train platform. Except now, there was no hesitation, no distance, just them. He waited until she reached him before speaking. "You nervous?" Olivia smirked. "About the job or about dating my boss?" Ethan raised a brow. "Technically, you're not dating your boss." She gave him a pointed look. His lips twitched. "Okay, fine. You're dating the CEO. But you're also the company's new associate marketing director, so technically, you outrank half the people in this building." Her stomach flipped at the reminder. When Ethan had asked her to stay, she had made it clear. She wasn't coming back to be someone standing in his shadow. If she returned, she wanted to earn her place. And he had made damn sure she did. She had been offered the promotion based on her work, her strategies, her success outside of Caldwell Industries. Ethan had stayed out of the hiring process entirely, letting her prove, once and for all, letting her prove, once and for all, that she belonged at the table. And now, as they stood side by side in the heart of the company that had brought them together, Olivia felt it. This wasn't just about love. This was about partnership. Ethan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "If it helps, I think dating the CEO is very good for your career." She rolled her eyes, shoving him lightly. "You're impossible." He smirked, and yet, here you are. The elevator chimed behind them, signaling that it was time to get to work. Olivia glanced at Ethan one last time, a warmth settling in her chest. Then she squared her shoulders and walked through the doors, ready for whatever came next. The adjustment was easier than she expected. Yes, the whispers still happened. The glances, the speculation, People trying to figure out how the former intern had not only returned, but had come back stronger. But this time, Olivia didn't care. Because she knew the truth. She knew what it had taken to get here. She knew the work she had put in, the battles she had fought to prove that she was more than just Ethan Caldwell's girlfriend. And, most importantly, she knew that Ethan had never been the reason for her success. If anything, he had been the one to challenge her, to push her to be better, to think bigger. And as the weeks passed, as she fell into the rhythm of her new role, leading campaigns, managing strategies, commanding rooms full of executives, she realized something. She was no longer trying to keep up. She was running the race beside him. One evening, long after the office had emptied out, Olivia sat at her desk, reviewing the latest proposal for a high-profile client. She was deep in concentration when a familiar voice broke the silence. "You're still here." She looked up to find Ethan leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, amusement glinting in his blue eyes. She smirked.
So are you.
He walked in, stopping just beside her desk. She raised a brow. "Oh." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, setting it on her desk. A single train ticket. Olivia blinked, then let out a breathless laugh.
Seriously?
He shrugged, smirking. Figured it worked once. She picked up the ticket, running her fingers over the familiar texture. A flood of memories rushed back. Falling asleep on his shoulder that night on the subway, spilling coffee on his expensive suit, missing her stop because she had been too caught up in the exhaustion of trying to prove herself. She had changed since then. And so had he. Ethan reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Come on," he murmured. "Let's go home." Her chest tightened at the way he said it. "Not your place. Not my place. Home." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "Okay." And as they walked out of the office together, side by side, equals partners in business and in life, Olivia knew one thing for certain. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Lesson from the story. At its core, Olivia and Ethan's journey is about choices. The ones we make out of fear, the ones we make out of pride, and the ones we make when we finally realize what truly matters. One of the biggest lessons from their story is that timing is never perfect, but the right person is always worth the risk. Ethan let Olivia go because he thought it was what she needed. Olivia walked away because she believed love wasn't enough. But in the end, they both learned that love isn't about perfect circumstances. It's about choosing each other, despite the obstacles. Another powerful takeaway is self-worth. Olivia never let her feelings for Ethan define her success. She fought for her place in the corporate world, not because of him, but for herself. And when she returned, it wasn't as the girl who fell for the CEO. It was as a woman who had earned her spot at the table. Love should never make you lose yourself. The right person will challenge you, push you, and inspire you to be better. But they will never ask you to become less. Lastly, the story teaches us that real success isn't just about ambition. It's about knowing what truly makes you happy. Olivia could have stayed in a job that looked good on paper, but it wasn't where her heart was. Ethan could have let his fears control him, but he chose love over ego. In the end, success means nothing if you don't have someone to share it with. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming, inspiring stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that stirs your soul. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in the next one.